39 beginning steps of the process of plasmid infusion. It's unbeknown that there are several things that play 27 signs of anaphase. The rest of which are plate 27 shows signs of anaphase failure. Plate 33 showing signs of moving on, and suddenly begin to discover several movements in plate 33 showing signs of plasma growth. Plate 33, 39, no movement, partial digestion failure.
Rachel could hear some of what was spoken. Most of the words were mumbled and muffled. For hours he would sit at his desk, peering through the microscope, poking and prodding at the specimen on the plate. He seemed somewhat familiar, but her mind was weakened from a steady drip of lorazepam and haloperidol. There were several other bags of unknown fluids hanging around her bed. All of the bags were attached to clear tubes, which were attached to needles. Each needle was stuck into various blood vessels in her body. Through her blurring vision, she could see tubes inserted into each arm. There was one in each leg and one in her chest. In the dark, cool atmosphere of the room, there was a single lamp over the desk where the man sat hours on end.
Testing for beta globin, purification, dilution, 80%.
He seemed familiar,
With an 80%.
but Rachel couldn't keep her thoughts together long enough to figure out why. He said very little. The only words he spoke all sounded like medical jargon.
With an 80% success rate, preparing for implant.
The lamp turned upward and shone its blinding light directly onto her face. The thin silhouette of a man turned to look at her. She should have been more afraid than she was, but she was smart enough to realize that had it not been for the drugs coursing through her veins, she would truly be terrified. The thin shadow of a man began to rise and grow until the light was completely blocked out. It came to rest just above her, and with a sharp but light click, a blinding white light flooded the scene. Her eyes slowly began to adjust, and the man's face began to slowly morph into formation. His eyes were a bit familiar, but the rest of his face was covered in a surgical mask. The man disappeared for a few moments as water began to run from a faucet and a scrubbing sound began. No amount of any drug could eliminate the icky feeling that came next. The heart rate monitor next to her head began to increase its beeping. She tried to scream, but nothing came out except for a hiss of air through her nose. She felt a cool, gloved hand on her right thigh as a long, thin plastic tube began to slowly violate her. She felt the lifeless object rising up through her midsection, and she thought maybe it would keep going straight up through her brain. There was a hot, sharp pain, and the tube began to slowly exit. The man covered her legs back up with the soft white linens and removed his gloves, as well as his mask. She knew him right away, but she couldn't quite figure out from where at first. The blinding light went out, and total darkness surrounded her. The desk light faded back into picture. Shortly after that, it clicked off. For a few moments, Rachel thought she would be left in the cool darkness. Her heart monitor began to increase again. A soothing music began to play as the room filled with a peaceful sea green light. Her heart rate returned to its below normal state, and she began to drift away into a deep, comfortable yet uneasy rest. Her last thought was, "Where am I?"
More on outcome and less on
The room once again began to come into focus.
the base test.
The thin man was talking to himself.
The fifth time,
Rachel understood most of the language he used.
can adjust
She
the
was
slide.
familiar with the jargon. Her mind was slightly more focused than the last time she was awake. The man was sitting at his usual spot by his desk. The room was still bathed in the blue-green light. She could see more of the room this time. The walls were lined with jars, beakers, medical equipment. She'd seen many rooms like it before at her previous job. Rachel sat in her tiny, greasy office on the first floor under the main entry staircase. It was a comfortable office, but nothing compared to the office she intended to have at this point in her life. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours to give her only child the opportunity to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's genetics department, it ended up being more than she could handle. Her mother died in an early age due to heart disease. Rachel always felt as if her poor mother had simply worked herself to death. She tried hard to honor her mother. She made good grades and excelled academically. But it always came down to money. No matter how hard she tried and how many times she applied, the grants and scholarships were never quite enough. She ended up taking every other year off of school to work and save money. It was hard transitioning from a student to a janitor. It was the only way she could continue to learn and keep up with her studies. Her duties allowed her classroom access to the lab and most of her subjects of study. She carefully tuned her cleaning routines to match the class schedules, and she always seemed to just pop in during all the crucial lectures. As the next year would roll around, she would be prepared and could keep up with the rest of the more privileged students who didn't need to take time off to pay for tuition. She was going on her third year at MIT. It was a working year, though. She was doing her best to understand the scribbled writing on the blackboard. She was unable to clean up during the usual lecture due to a massive water leak earlier that day. Unfortunately, the incident required the entire janitorial staff's attention. She was forced to clean the laboratory later that evening. She was just beginning to put the pieces of the lecture together in her head when a door opened and she was forced to resume mopping.
"Miss, I don't believe that spot's going to get any cleaner. Don't you agree?"
The professor spoke, accusingly, but jokingly. Rachel didn't seem to get the gist of the joke, though. She resumed mopping as her face began to heat up and grow red from humiliation and anger. She had long since accepted the fact that she would not have a social life in college. As a student, she had far too much to lose by socializing and partying. And as a janitor, no one ever even made eye contact with her, unless she made a mistake and was being corrected. It was a humiliating life for this poor girl. She was strong and determined, and would have been an inspiration to all lower-class struggling women if she were ever able to graduate. A foot suddenly appeared in front of her mop and began to tap the floor. She knew she had been busted, again, studying and learning, while she should have been working. Most of her professors didn't recognize her or pretended not to recognize her on her off years. This one did, though.
"You do know I was just kidding, right?"
The words registered, but Rachel was still coming down from the humiliation and anger. It would be a few moments before she would be able to look up. Her heart rate slowly began to drop, and her eyes slowly began to rise. The dull black loafers still tapping on the floor began to readjust and assumed a normal forward-facing position. The perfectly creased but worn slacks seemed to hang and sag loosely around a thin set of bony hips. The shiny black belt was worn and cracked at places and seemed to hang at a slant on what little it had to cling to. Professor Thompson was a 40-ish man, whom she'd come to recognize from her first year at MIT. He was a very good instructor, very thorough, and very empathetic. He sympathized with Rachel when he noticed she was struggling to stay focused and had missed a few lectures. He pulled her aside for a talk, and she explained her situation to him. He himself, an only parent of a daughter close to her own age, held an even stronger sense of empathy towards Rachel. He recognized her intelligence, and it was even his idea that she take off a year to save money. He even recommended she take a job at the school to stay closer to her studies.
If you can stand the humility, the janitorial staff has access to all of the classes. And if you time your schedule just right, you'll never miss a lecture.
It was the best advice she'd ever been given, and it turned out to be very fruitful. Not having a father figure growing up, Rachel tended to misjudge men, and in turn ended up in a few bad relationships. Nothing brutal or abusive, but she just had a habit of settling for men of a much lower caliber than herself. Professor Thompson, she thought, was the only man who ever truly understood her. She developed an unhealthy obsession towards him. She decided one day to make a move. She would ask to talk with him after class, wait until everyone was away, then she would move in as close as she could, and then kiss him. Thankfully, she never got that opportunity. That day came and went, and Professor Thompson just never showed up. She would later find that his daughter had fallen ill and that he would not be returning. She tried to get up the courage to visit him, but without his help and leniency in class, she found herself having to study late into the mornings after work. She barely finished that first year. And now, standing before her, was this thin shell of a man she once knew. It looked like Professor Thompson. The same hazel eyes, the same thin-rimmed glasses, the same long, intricate fingers. Only the eyes were reddish, the glasses very worn and somewhat bent, the hands covered in various fresh and healed scratches. Rachel stared back at him in shock. He was no longer the same man she'd once fallen in love with.
I know. I'm a little worse for wear.
He did have the same soft voice, but it was a bit ragged and much weaker. She tried to smile the best she could, but taking in what he had become was difficult. She nearly sobbed, but quickly turned it into a nervous laughter, which led to an awkward hug that she instantly regretted.
It's good to see you too.
He laughed nervously. They spoke for a while, and he explained that he'd fallen apart after his daughter became ill. After she died, he went through a deep depression, until finally one day, he decided to end it. He opened up and told her about how he'd swallowed a bottle of pills and went to sleep only to wake up 4 days later, alive, but very sick. After the conversation, Rachel began to see less of a shell and more of the man he used to be. She nearly felt that old obsession as it attempted to rise up from deep within her soul again. She was strong enough to suppress it, but it was still down there somewhere. There was something different about him, It wasn't all looks. Rather, it was the look he gave her. It was the look of desperation. Not the kind of look you would expect a man in his position to give to the young, pretty woman that she was. He looked at her as if he were dying of thirst and needed a drink of water. She was polite, but a bit disturbed by the interaction. She politely declined his invitation to his home for tea. Later on, she began to feel guilty. After all, he'd helped her so much. He obviously didn't want sex. Maybe he just needed a friend, the same way she needed one not so long ago. She began to wiggle her mouth back and forth nervously as she heard the slow, dragging footsteps approaching the door. She'd made it a point to wear a nice but long dress and to wear little makeup as not to give him the wrong idea. It made her sad to think that not too long ago she would have done just the opposite.
Rachel, you came.
Rachel felt a little warm inside, knowing that it made him so happy to see her. He had a neat but very dusty study. Rachel walked around admiring his books. She could see herself in a similar study of her own. It would be much more brightly lit, of course, and the shelves would be bright white rather than dark oak. She would occasionally remove a book, wiping dust from its cover, study it, flip through and read a few words, and then move on to another. Professor Thompson returned with a steaming kettle of water and a tray with a small selection of fine teas. They talked about biology and his books, as well as how she was doing financially and academically. After a while, she began to get bored. Or rather, she mistook her drowsiness as boredom. She began to yawn, apologizing as she did so.
No, Rachel. Sweet child. I'm so sorry.
His eyes, red and watery, began overflowing with tears. They ran down his cheeks. The sparkle of light radiating from the last tear began to twirl and splinter off into a twinkling star. As the room became black like the night sky, when the sparkle disappeared, she awoke in a hospital bed. She was not in a hospital, though. She tried to speak as she suddenly began to realize where she was and who her captor was.
Hi, Pumpkin. Pumpkin? It's Rachel, you jerk! What are you doing to me?
She noticed right away he was not looking at her. He was looking at what was beneath his hand. Her stomach was protruding outward, almost unnaturally, as he gently rubbed and caressed it.
Professor! What have you done to me?
She nearly screamed and tried reaching for her stomach, but her hands were stopped within inches by the chains binding her hands and feet to the makeshift hospital bed. Rachel began thrashing around violently and in terror.
Rachel, calm down, and I'll explain, please. I don't want to drug you. It's not good for the baby.
The professor leaned over her quickly and began to squeeze the plunger down on a large syringe. Rachel immediately began to lose interest in her own anger and fear. After a few moments, she simply didn't care at all. The professor then clicked off the bright lamp above her head, and a screen appeared next to it, glowing with colorful flowers and soft green meadows, as well as other scenes of peaceful landscapes. Soft music began to fill the room. She glanced down and to the right and saw a pair of insane hazel eyes staring directly into hers. She could hear his equally insane whispers.
I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry.
as he tried to justify his actions with apologies. She gained enough strength to twist her right palm upwards and weakly extend her middle finger. There was a click, and she was left with a skinny, sickly, negative image of the mad professor just before he faded into the blackness.
Hello, Pumpkin.
She could barely open her eyes. They were so matted. She felt like she'd been asleep for weeks. The professor was rubbing a cold substance on her stomach. She slowly began to come to life. Her stomach was gigantic. The cold liquid was being spread all around a giant basketball, which used to be a tight, flat belly. She felt the panic rising in her throat, but it would go no further. The professor began to roll something with a dark screen over to her bedside. She had seen such machines in movies before, also in instruction videos before she changed her major from pediatrics to genetic research. She could only watch in shock as he rolled the ultrasound sensor around on her belly. The image began to form on the screen. It was unrecognizable. She half expected to see a head, belly, legs, hands. None of what was on the screen appeared even remotely related to those things.
What the hell is inside me?
She thought numbly. The professor's face began to grow cold. He dropped the sticky cold instrument and turned away. There was a long silence as he stood swaying with his head down. Rachel began to move her wrists around, realizing she could actually do so this time. Objects began to fly around the room as the professor began to lose control. Rachel began to cry and moan, afraid of what he would do to her. He darted towards her as her eyes grew wide in fear. He passed her, and she heard a drawer slam open as he began to dig around inside of it. He quickly returned with a bottle of pills. He opened the top and shook out several pills. He began to shove them into her mouth one at a time, and she nearly choked on them. There was a flood of water as he shoved a plastic bottle into her mouth and squeezed it, forcing the pills down her throat into her stomach, as well as water into her lungs. She began convulsing and gagging for air. Her body wasn't functioning the way it should, and her coughs were weak and somewhat ineffective. The water burned as it dripped into her lungs. She continued to gag and cough as her body twisted in its restraints. As she fought for her next breath, she could hear a calm voice by the desk.
Back to business. There's nothing much we can do about that. Implant 41 into subject 16 was a complete failure. Massive tissue overgrowth.
Maybe it was all a nightmare. She thought so just before her eyes began to open. She could hear a gentle breeze and feel the cool wind on her face. As she began to blink, reality set in, and she saw the rectangular screen in front of her. An oscillating fan created the false breeze she so desperately hoped was real. The drugs were wearing off, and she began to feel the full force of her fear and desperation. She began to sob and shake in her state of misery. The professor approached the bed, and with no sympathy, began to shine a light into her eyes and poke at her sore belly. He lifted her gown, and she could see that her stomach was covered in bandages, but was nearly back to normal, still a bit swollen. It took her a moment to realize he was talking.
More I could do about it. So the best thing to do was to leave it the way it is, you see. I think it was the drug.
She'd been unconscious for a long time.
That was the problem.
Weeks, maybe.
My
Who
plan
knows?
was flawless, Pumpkin. This
The
time,
professor never even
It
acknowledged
will
that she was awake.
work.
To him,
You'll see.
she was only a vessel,
Daddy loved you
an
very much.
incubator for his
See you
sick
soon.
plan. The memories of the entire incident began to play out in her head. The talk of mitosis and anaphase plasmids. He was trying to clone his daughter. Rachel began to twist and fight with what little strength she had. He quickly approached her and leaned over. And for the first time since he gave her the laced tea, he looked into her eyes.
Please, you have to stay calm or this is not going to work. You see, I've solved it. It's going to work this time. Bastard.
She managed to say weakly.
You'll burn in hell for this.
His eyes began to grow wide. He slowly began to retreat. The professor backed over his chair and fell backwards onto the floor. He never took his eyes away from Rachel's eyes. He continued to scoot backwards, away from her, as if she were holding a gun to his chest. His face began to contort into a disgusted scowl, and tears began to form in his bloodshot eyes.
Rachel, I'm sorry. I'm so
The reality of what he'd done
sorry.
began to sink in. The professor slowly got to his feet and disappeared into the dark end of the room. A brief light appeared at the end of the room and disappeared as he closed the door behind him. Rachel continued to sob. She was in pain, weak, bound. Her sobbing continued until it was stopped cold by a loud the single gunshot, still ringing throughout the makeshift laboratory. The gentle, fake breeze from the oscillating fan continued to blow. The screen, once filled with visions of gentle landscapes, had long run out, and a still grayish-blue image replaced them. The music was still playing over and over again, driving her mad. Every time the same phrase of violins and strings repeated the same boring crescendos. Over the next few days, she twisted and pulled with her strongest hand until the leather straps began to loosen and weaken. Now lubricated with blood, she gave a final scream and pulled. Her skin began to tear from around her wrist, but that did not stop her. She couldn't stop. Although her life had been full of struggle and strife, she was not yet ready to die. More importantly, she refused to die in that place. Bloody, bruised, sore, and weak, she began to unravel the last strap from her leg. She was still bound by the tubes jammed into her veins. She shakily and painfully removed the needles, one by one, until finally she was free and bleeding all over. Her legs were useless. She found out the hard way as she tried to stand but collapsed onto the hard, cold concrete floor and passed out. When her eyes opened, she was moving. There was a flurry of activity as many men in dark blue uniforms scurried about the place, making horrific sounds as they made discoveries that no man should ever have to witness. She was once again placed onto a hospital bed. This time, there were 2 men above her, and both made eye contact with her and assured her that she would be okay. As the medical team began to move her from the dark, cold basement, she heard the horrific sounds of grown men crying, wild shrieks and screams.
Cover her face, damn it! Don't let her see this.
No matter how hard they tried to shield Rachel's eyes from the passing abominations, she fought to see them all. A blur of images flashed by. Lumps of an undefined matter of hair and fingers in jars of yellowish fluid. Beakers and glass tubes with various stages of fetuses, each missing eyes or limbs, or having more than they should. Finally, they approached the cages. He kept them all. Each cage was labeled with 1 word and 1 number. Pumpkin 12. Screaming, banging her bloody, oversized head against the cage door. Pumpkin 9. Rolling around in her own body fluids. Just a massive, half-grown and poorly formed limbs. Pumpkin 3. Pumpkin 2. Pumpkin 1. Three months later, Rachel was once again lying in a hospital bed. There was a kind, young, friendly face standing over her. Her name was Lucy. She attended medical school at Bunker Hill Community College with Rachel some years back. After a long conversation, Lucy stood, smiling down at Rachel.
Okay, Rach, I'm going to ask you this one more time. Are you sure you want to see this?
Rachel thought back to all the horrors she'd survived during her captivity and decided that she could handle anything.
I'm sure. Okay.
Lucy lifted the gown covering Rachel's swollen belly. The long scar, now much less visible than it was months ago. The 2 young women turned their attention to the black and gray screen on the ultrasound machine.
Okay, this is going to be a little cold,